Awesome. So I'm glad that we're getting to talk today.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right in and talk to me about what got you into the sport performance psychology space.
Oh. Well, first of all, I'm a lifelong athlete. And in the early 80s, I did an internship when I was getting my PhD with the first clinical and sports psychologist with the track and field team for the Olympics. And so I did a full year with her, and I got really interested in pursuing this as a psychologist. And back then, very little to no people were talking about sports psychology. And so I couldn't even find somebody to help me do a dissertation focused on marathon runners, which I tried to do initially. And so I stayed interested once I got my PhD and started seeing some athletes in the late 80s. And then I found that I really liked working with athletes. And so I started to have that as one of my specialties and really dove in much more in the early 90s when AASP was still a very young organization. And AASP is the Association of Applied Sports Psychology. And I've continued to be, I was an athlete as a young kid in my youth, and in high school, I played tennis and badminton. And tried out for the cross country team, made the team, but my mother wouldn't let me participate because it wasn't ladylike. And so I always had an interest in running. And during getting my master's I was up at Humboldt State for a couple of semesters. I got a golden retriever and started running. And within 6 months, I had moved back to San Diego because that's where I was living. That's where I went to undergrad and my master's eventually, and ran my first marathon in 6 months. And continued to be interested in athletes, but back then there was very little support for it. There were certainly no jobs for it. But I did join the Association of Applied Sports Psychology, I think it was 1993, and continued to see athletes. I worked certainly with a whole bunch, a lot with runners, with cyclists, which are my two main sports as an adult. And then I became also a competitive ultra runner. And one year I got a great coach that had me using my heart rate monitor, and all of a sudden my time started dropping because I really wasn't running close to my full potential. And I went from mid-pack to front of the pack. And in 1993, I was in the first Ultra Grand Prix series in the Western region and ended up coming in third overall. And I had won a couple races that year. And the next year proceeded to do really well as also, but then got into cycling too. So I started doing long distance cycling. I've done a lot of double centuries. My husband, who I met cycling, and I did California Triple Crown one year. That's 3 or more double centuries. And so in the late 90s, I really got interested in writing a book about women in sport because one of the books at that time that was big in the probably late 80s, early 90s was this book called Women Who Love Too Much. And basically, her premise was that all women talk too much about relationships. And and they were all codependent if they talk about relationships, right? So I knew that couldn't be true. And so I started to put together a book. This is my first book to explain women and to look closely at the research of women and words and sport and how they operated. And one of the things, there are a number of things I found, but one of the things that was really clear is it's much more effective to coach women and men somewhat differently. And so I wrote, took me 20 years, but I got this book together. It's called Sisterhood in Sports, How Females Collaborate and Compete. And people go, well, can they be? Well, they can be on a team with it and be competing together competitively, but they can also be even on a cross-country team and still support each other. You know, I'm scoring points. When I ran one of my marathons in a pouring downpour, I was running for a team and there were 5 of us and we only needed 3 people to score. Only 2 of us finished it. And so it was rather discouraging because individual sports back then were a lot different than they are now, where there's a lot more sensitivity about team cohesion and a team getting together. And one of the things that I talked about is I think there was a female brain, the book that came out, and that in certain ways, men's brains and women's are different, not huge, but enough to make a huge difference, where relationships are primary for women in terms of what we talk about. And there had been research on somehow the thinking that we talked more. And then there was some studies done to disprove that. But the one thing all the studies agreed on back then was that women talk significantly more about relationships and their personal lives than men do in sports or otherwise. And so the first book was meant to kind of make all this normal, because the research was there, and to start talking about the fact that women, coaching and working with women can be quite different than coaching and working with men.
So why did that take you 20 years from start to finish?
Well,
and how did what you were finding at the beginning change by the end? Or did it?
I was used to, back then, I was much more used to doing academic writing. And so a lot of things happened in that period. And finally in mid 2000s, no, even a little earlier than that, my husband goes, well, if you want to write this book, why don't you go hang around writers? Basically, so I could also learn how to write to general interest as opposed to academic, and make it interesting and talk about, you know, what you really see, like behind me, you know, with the green trees and the sunshine, bursting with joy behind me. So I joined a writers group, a big one. And then I joined another writers club. I ended up being on the board of that for like 8 or 9 years. And the writers group, the woman who ran it, she had advanced writing workshops, but she was mainly a travel writer, not a nonfiction writer. But to be invited to one of her groups was a big deal. And I think that when she did that, that really helped me turn a corner. And the other nonfiction writer in that group and I are still friends. And she's about to come out with her 3rd book. She's not athletic at all, but she is a therapist.
So what do you think aided in that book specifically winning 5 different literary awards? Because that's quite a feat, and it just means that you struck a nerve with the people that are reading this book and needing this book.
Right. Well, I think what really happened, Julia, is that there's not a lot of stuff written about women, particularly based on research, women in sports and research, to back it up, really. And I actually entered 5 contests with the hope of winning something. And so it was rather shocking to me that I won something in every contest I entered. And the sports categories in these contests, I actually ended up being a gold medal winner in 4 of them, and then a very national and prestigious book contest called Forward Reviews gave me an honorable mention, which they don't always do, in the women's studies category. So that's why I ended up with 5 literary awards, because I was just trying to win something. And
I think it's like that competitive nature. It just translates out of sport and into every single other phase of your life. I think that's what's so interesting about doing this podcast, because not many of the people that I'm interviewing and have interviewed in the past are still with their sport. But what is so interesting is that even if they've been removed 1 year, 5 years, 25 years, it doesn't even matter, because what they've learned in sport, the competitive nature, the teamwork that they've had to exhibit through their sport, translates into other parts of their life, and they end up excelling kind of by circumstance.
Well, I think also athletes get more exposure to setting goals and mapping out steps to accomplish those goals. And so when they're in their life, people who are really successful, I think, probably set up a lot of goals and then plan out the steps to achieve them. And one of the things that I learned over the years is that at least for me personally, that I was capable of achieving a lot more than I believed I could. And so with the newest book called Stand Up and Shout Out How, Stand Up and Shout Out Women's Fight for Equal Pay, Equal Rights, and Equal Opportunities in Sports, I only entered 2 contests, and the Forward Reviews, I got a bronze medal in the sports category in Forward Reviews, so that's a really big deal. And then the other contest comes out in September, and they reviewed my book unsolicited. This other, because they also do reviews. And the person who reviewed the current book said that she had been waiting for my book for decades. And she was a former Division I athlete herself.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But it's interesting because there's also been backlash. And I don't know why Amazon is doing this, but there have been a couple of very angry men reviews, and they keep the angry man one as front and center, even though other reviews have come in after that are much better. So I'm going to pursue that, because I think it's very hard for men to acknowledge how much women love sports too, and how that they're really capable of sports, and certain sports they actually can excel in over men. That's a very hard one for men. One of the things that used to happen to me when I was actively competing was men would like try to run with me and think, oh, we can beat her, it's no big deal. And what would happen is, I remember specifically on this race called Cool Canyon Crawl, that it was a 50K, and I'm running along, and I got 4 or 5 guys around me, and they're all like going, oh God, we're all, you guys, we're really running out too hard. We're going too fast, and I'm looking at my heart rate monitor, and I'm thinking I'm perfect. And so at the end of that race, the closest one of those guys came in a half an hour behind me. So they were going too fast. And I did so well, I was really surprised in particular. And that season was a really good season, relative to the times and relative to what women were participating in, and really I think there was a lot of psychological barriers to competition. This is, let's see, this is like early 90s. And so I think there were a lot of psychological barriers for women to, be really good in sport. And I'll tell you one more story that I think I talked to you about before, but
I love your story times. Like our pre-interview was only supposed to be like half an hour, and we talked for legitimately over an hour. And I loved it. So I was so excited to have you on this interview because I knew that the anecdotes would just pour out of you, and I
right.
love them.
Well, the other one was when I was, it actually is two things. It's when I was running a 50-mile American River, and I just had a good sense of myself that year. That was when I started using the heart rate monitor. I was running much faster. My times were incredibly significantly faster. And I had gone up to a friend of mine who I said, well, Errol, I'm going to break 8.5 hours today. And he's like, well, Joan, you haven't even broken 9. I mean, aren't you kind of setting your sights too high? I said, no, you wait. Well, I ran it in 8:27. And so he never, ever disputed my predictions about my running again after that. And then the next week, a friend of mine, I was running a marathon that I was really vying to win, which I did. And that trail marathon. And I was, as an ultra runner, I've been used to running lots of miles every weekend. So another guy who had come in, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes behind me at American River, unbeknownst to me, had his whole goal for that race was to beat me, the marathon. Well, he beat me by like 10 seconds, something like 20 seconds. And then, and I happened to win that race. And then he apparently couldn't run for 3 weeks. He had pushed himself so hard, he was limping around and couldn't run a stitch. So it's funny back then because I didn't, he tells me all this, like a couple months later. And I thought, well, it was pretty courageous of him to admit he couldn't run a stitch for 3 weeks, but what a dumb thing to do that he to try to beat me just for that.
Like he beat you, but at what cost?
Yeah, right.
Like for what?
Yeah, exactly. It's very funny. And in the couple of years that I was really competitive, I dropped my times, like one race by an hour and a half, another race by 45 minutes. It was like significant drops. And I had no idea I was capable of doing that. And if I hadn't had this really great coach, who's still my friend to this day, turned me on to heart rate monitor, I would have never really known what I could do. And
So how much of distance running would you consider mental and how much would you consider physical? Like once you get to like 15 or 20 miles, how do you continue to propel yourself forward? And especially when you're running ultras, I mean, what continues in your brain to say I'm going to continue running this? I think you're frozen. Oh no. Can you hear me? Oh no, where did you go?
oops.
Hi.
I had ran the Vermont 100, and I was like, I had worked out in the gym religiously for 6 months. I'd done tons of miles to prepare. I was like there, and I went back to Vermont and so I had some male friends. We were all together doing it, and I didn't bring any crew or pacer or anything. I've always been pretty independent, so that wasn't necessarily difficult to do. But what happened is I was in a good mood all day, and stopped at an aid station, then went right away because I've always learned in these long endurance things that you don't hang around at aid stations, because that could be the kiss of death for some people. So what happened is I was in a good mood, and a guy who had been there from California, who's kind of a legend in ultra running, this guy named John Medinger, he shows up at mile 70 and says, "I'm going to pace you." And I go, "Oh," because he never paced slower people, and let alone women. So his fast male pacer dropped out, and he goes, "The reason I'm going to pace you is because I've never seen somebody in such a good mood in a 100-mile race." And so I was, since it was my first 100, and I, he knew he was the expert at the time, or somebody really well versed in it. I did whatever he told me to do. I ate stuff I normally don't eat because I'm not a candy person, but I ate it. And so he said, "We got two goals. The first goal is we're going to get you well under 24 hours. And the second goal is I want you to beat 5 or 6 of the horses that were running a concurrent horse race was going on, or, horse endurance event, I should say." And so at mile 93, for the first time, I got soup because I was my energy was dipping a little bit. And I sat down, drank the soup, got up, and he goes, "That's good. 2.5 minutes. Now let's go." And I was so glad he was there, because Vermont, the end of the Vermont 100 is in very dense forest. So, one of the things about running is I always like to kind of see around me, but at night in dense forest, you don't see a lot of stuff around you. And I came in and it was, I don't know, 23:17, I think. And as I told you, I was so excited that I was like shaking my hands up and down, and like, I did it. I ran 100 miles. And this one woman who'd been in ultra running for a while just looked at me like I was crazy, and I thought, too bad. I can't believe I did it. And I actually was able to go back to the hotel and sleep for a few hours before the noontime, because I finished before, I think the race started at 4, and so I finished at 3:15 in the morning or something. And so I actually got some sleep and came back for the award ceremonies, and ended up being 10th woman in that race. So it was pretty exciting.
So that was your very first 100-miler.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing.
Still my best, and I'm not doing them anymore. So
So like, what mentality do just distance runners as a whole have to endure, or have to
they
train
have to
their
be
brains?
positive about it, and instead of looking at what they haven't done, or I've got all this to do, it's really much more helpful to think about all you've done and how much progress you're making. Like, I'm already a fourth done. Great. I'm already a half done. And one of the things I did when I taught, I don't know if I told you, but I taught at the Western States training camp a couple years. One of the things that I did was a visualization of the whole course with the 300 and some people that were at the meeting, at the workshop that I was doing. And so what I did is I built in this visualization going along the trail, some down spots. So they didn't have the expectation that they would feel good and positive the whole way. And, things to do to get them out of the down spots, in terms of, particularly with thoughts. I think the thoughts are very powerful. And if people can work with thoughts and reframe negative ones to more positive ones, that what they say, positive self-talk, that can make a big difference. And instead of looking at like legs, or, oh my God, they're so heavy, it's like, my legs are strong. I have strong legs. And another trick I would use, and was teaching this to the workshop, is it was in a movie actually years ago that was a takeoff on the Dipsy. And what that they did in that movie was, the coach in that movie would always say, "Soar the hills." and burn the downhills. So one of the things about hills is if you're thinking of your soaring, it's more a light kind of way of going up hills. And we don't think of burning the downhills. We think of, soaring the downhills. But I think burning them means just giving it your all, as one way to approach it. And I think people need, now not everybody can do visualization directly because they have too much anxiety. So I might have, if they get a rough spot, say if they're beach people, well, just imagine yourself that you're in the ocean in the Caribbean and you're swimming along and you're feeling so light and wonderful and you've got the heat on you and it's just a good thing. One of the things this year at Western States, which was pretty remarkable, was that 3 women finished in the top 10. And it was one of those hot years. Like the year I ran when we were in the canyons, it was 114 degrees. And I think this year the heat was a similar thing. The nice thing about running at night is it does cool down. But getting through those canyons is tough. And what they used to do, I'm not sure if they're doing it now, but they used to set up showers that you could run through at one of the aid stations when you were in the heat of the day. And just the feel of that and the calmness of the water running over you as you're running was really helpful to kind of reinvigorate oneself. And I paced a guy, I don't know if I told you, I paced a guy who was from Austria. First exposure to Western States. And he was a fast runner. And I was very afraid I couldn't keep up with him. And they said, oh no, Joan, you'll be fine, don't worry. Because this was even when I was slower. And so one of the things about being a sports psychologist is I'm usually pretty good at reading people. And this guy was having a really bad day. And I was pushing him along on California Street. There's 3 aid stations on California Street of Western States. He sat down and wanted to lay down in the Chase Lounge and goes, oh, I don't know. I'm not, maybe should drop because I'm not going to make the under 24 hours. And then on the next Chase Lounge, the previous year's winner laid down next to him on the Chase Lounge. And I said, look who's next to you. Herb Tanzer, if you quit whining, get up and let's go. And he was, they're very gruff and matter of fact, Austrian men. They're kind of real tough guys. And so I had to do something that is not really in my nature, but it was what he needed. And that was like all along the way is tell him to stop whining and get going and look how far we've come. And, you can do it. You're going to make the under 24, but if you complain and sit around, you're not. So there was a lot of that stuff. And I was paced. I could run with him fine and move him along. And what was really interesting is that when we got up to Roby Point, which is like 2.5 miles from the finish, something like that, or 1.5 miles maybe. Anyhow, he's like running along, I'm running along, and look what a great job you're doing, come on, you're going to finish, you're going to be under 24 hours. He's like, yeah. So he comes in across the finish line in 23 something. He was fine. And he wasn't even close to the cutoff. And a girlfriend of his runs up to him, oh, and he goes, no, get away. It's because of Joan. It's because of Joan I finished. And, the whole time I've been pacing him, which was like 38 miles, I'd never seen the girlfriend. So she wasn't even on the course. She shows up at the end. And it was fun. I mean, I really enjoyed, I think in certain ways, I enjoyed pacing people just as much as I enjoyed running it myself. Because it was fun to help them, and I think that pacers really, for big, long races, need to be very positive and encouraging kind of people. And because even in the way I was doing it with him was a way that he felt encouraged. So it's just different for different people.
So how did that experience change the way that you work with athletes who don't distance run? I mean,
Oh, well, I've
I have
worked
a
with,
list of sports that you've worked with that includes running, cycling, soccer, football, softball, basketball, boxing, tennis, golf, triathlon, and rugby. And obviously, not all those athletes take to constructive criticism the way that your last anecdote does. So how do you change the way that you work with the athletes depending on what their sport is?
well, first of all, I need to do an assessment and make sure that they're just really able to deal with performance stuff. Some people come in and they need performance stuff, but they also need some clinical work because that's some work on themselves personally because that there's a lot of blocks there. And each sport in itself has different aspects that where people get stuck. So what we do is all these sports I learned about prior to seeing these people. And so I know a lot about many sports and try to look at where their problem area is and work with that in a way that it doesn't become a problem area, particularly if they get stuck. And, that might be, relaxing the shoulders, that might be teaching them how to focus better in their sport. It might be a variety of techniques, imagery, so that there's each sport, you have to take each person in each sport individually when you're working with them individually. Now, when I worked with a softball team at San Francisco State, I was first brought in by the coach to work with the pitchers and catchers. And the biggest problem with the pitchers and catchers is they were so caught up in thinking about the other team, they weren't connecting with each other. And so one of the things we did a couple things. First of all, it's like, okay, quit focusing on the other team. You have to focus on what you're doing, what you want to accomplish, and what the pitcher is talking to you about. And the catcher in terms of their suggestions. And also, when's the last time you guys went out and had a meal? Ooh. So they actually went out with the rest of the team. They all went bowling. They had dinner and went bowling. I think they had pizza. And the next game they played much better. So what we did when I worked with that team was I really worked on this whole sense of team cohesion and collaboration. And I have a picture, it's on my website that's not up yet, of myself sitting in a circle with all the women. So that we're all kind of working together in terms of different ideas in sports. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to ask how, when you meet an athlete for the first time, you can say, okay, this is a performance issue versus a clinical based issue, and if there is overlap.
Oh,
Because not every team you can look at and say, okay, this is a team cohesion issue or this is an issue with the coaching dynamic.
Well, it's interesting because when I do an assessment, I do take information about them, a history of sport, any issues they think might block them. And if they describe things like, I'm not motivated, I can't get going, I have trouble focusing, a list of depression symptoms, then I would consider that more of a dual problem. Because there are a lot of athletes that have mood disorders. And what I mean by mood disorders are depression, anxiety, there's even agitated depression that can seem like anxiety, but it's really depression. And then bipolar types of things. And so people who have I have a rugby player right now I'm working with who is clearly bipolar. And his manic stuff at times has gotten into him into some serious problems. So, and he's very resistant to the deal with the clinical, even though he's like now in a really terrible depression. And so I'm like, well, there's chemical imbalance in the brain, and there's some genetic possibilities, and there's this. And he's like, well, I don't trust the internet. He said, but I trust you. So if you want to pick out some things for me to read from the internet, I'll do that. And part of his not his kind of resistance to looking around himself is I think he's just really, really depressed. Because he's gotten out of rugby and now he wants to try to get back in. And was a college player and was trying to go to minor league rugby and kind of flamed out, I think, because he has these flare-ups of mania that interfere, but also these dips of depression that interfere. And so he's an example of somebody who has both. I had another woman who happened to be a rugby player who was trying to make the national team, and she had injuries. That was her biggest problem. And we were working so she would not like overtrain or get herself back into it, because she was really at the level of wanting to get to the camp for the national, where they select the national team from, and had been very close. But this injury she got, she went back too fast and really injured herself worse, but stayed involved with the team and helps out in rugby. And because her injury was really, career ending. But with her, it was much more just performance. It wasn't clinical. It was, the things she could do, but also dealing with the injury. People who have injuries who try to push them too hard. I think you have more of that than not pushing hard enough. Don't give the time they need to let things really heal. And they're the ones that get themselves in trouble about not going back to their sport quite in the way they'd like.
Yeah, I wanted to ask how you deal with an athlete who is rehabbing from an injury and trying to return to play, and how dealing with those kind of athletes who may be more tentative returning to the tenacity that they had prior to their injury versus an athlete who has performance issues but is not plagued by an injury. I mean, how do you deal with those two populations differently?
Well, I think with injured athletes, first of all, you have to understand their injury. So you have to be in touch, at least with their physical therapist, and find out what the issue is. Now, see, I've had physical therapists refer me, like one guy who was like progressing beautifully, and he was thinking he wasn't going fast enough. And she sent him to me, and we got talking about realistic expectations. And then he went back to her and slowed down because he realized he was trying to go faster than his body was going. So injuries, there's such a range of injuries, in terms of, some people get injuries that are just career ending, period. Oh, excuse me. And it's not helpful. And it's really hard to get them to stop. I had a gal years ago who was at the Olympic Center training to be on the Olympic team, who was a cyclist. And she hurt her back so badly that it really was a career-ending thing. And she just had the hardest time accepting that. So we talk about it, how she'd go, and then she'd go out with all her friends who were like at that higher level and try to push herself to ride with them, and then would hurt herself again. She did that 2 or 3 times, and finally realized, I have to work on really accepting this. It's very hard, particularly with elite and super high level athletes, to come to grips with that kind of stuff. And also, there's also the transition out of being a professional sport athlete or Olympian or whatever. And I don't think that that's one area I think where sports psychologists could really help is transitioning into civilian life, so to speak. So, and I think the thing about performance enhancement is I work a lot anywhere from recreational to, pro level athletes I have over the years. And the intensity of elite and pro level athletes is a whole different thing than, say, a recreational athlete or even an amateur athlete that's very good. And so you have to adjust expectations, first of all, and you have to help them adjust their expectations. And unfortunately, I had the rugby gal and the cycling gal who just, they injured themselves out of their sport. And then I've had other people who go back and now they've got more tools in terms of what they're thinking and the actions they're taking. And, if muscles are tensing up, learning how to release them, like practicing progressive muscle relaxation outside of sport. And then learning, one of the tools I use is to have people go through their whole bodies from the top of their head down to their feet and having them release, relax, and let go of their muscles. Because some people are so tense that if you ask them to tense it up more, it's very hard for them to really feel much releasing. So I have this alternative way that I work with athletes in terms of trying to help them really focus in on what are their liabilities and what are their assets, and minimizing the liabilities, say like the negative stuff, and maximizing their assets. So like even when they're playing a sport, for tennis is a really good example. There's people who are great at serving, and there's people that are mediocre, and there's people that are terrible. And so we do different things, obviously, with the mediocre and the really not so good. And also how their backhand shots are, their forehand shots are. So there's a lot of, and who their opponents are too. One of the things that I see that I was working with this a highly competitive amateur tennis player, and he would get intimidated by his opponents. And so I'd have him think about things that made him feel as big as them. You're as big as your opponent. You're as strong as your opponent, and you can beat this guy. But the big and strong part was this tennis player was 6'3" and big guy. And I was like, use your size to your advantage, and he started doing that, and his game got considerably better. And we worked together for a certain period of time, and then he was done. I think with strictly performance athletes, you don't necessarily have to do a huge amount of time. Some people can come in and see you for 3 or 4 sessions, or even one. That's even happened with one, and they get better. And then there's those that take a really long time to get better, and we just have to. I'm very persistent. That's probably one of my greatest assets, is try to teach people to not give up and to persist and really evaluate with their coach what they're capable of. And I'll teach them some of the mental skills to help them do that.
So how has the scope of your work changed from the beginning of your career to now?
Well, now I'm doing less clinical work. I'm more focused on writing, because I'm starting to write a third book on female athletes and on advocacy and female athletes. And I'm also so happy to be teaching at San Jose State. I've taught a lot of places. This is the best fit I've ever had. And that's because they have a really good athletic mind and they have an underlying respect for athletics at San Jose State. And the father, I think, two of the fathers of applied sports psychology that were actually working directly with athletes in the 60s were Tutko and Ogilvy. And they were based in the psychology department at San Jose State. So in a lot of ways, San Jose State is where, you know, some of that early applied work really started. And so there's tremendous support for athletics there. And so they have, you know, a lot of really fine athletes and, you know, even from out of internationally. I mean, I had a student who was a water polo player from Croatia. And the coach was, I hate to say it, but this guy's coach was kind of misogynistic. And he wrote all this stuff about women that was not only stupid, wasn't true. And I really let him have it in a paper, but we met in a Zoom and talked about it, he and I, and about women are really good at this stuff and you have to read more and you have to understand. And unfortunately, your coach doesn't really have the clear perspective on this. So you have to be really careful about this. And this guy totally turned around in class. He was completely respectful. He never pulled any kind of nonsense again. And he ended up with a good, you know, good grade because I'm always evaluating people when it's kind of like even being a sports psychologist, you got to be evaluating people all the time while you're going along. And in fact, this semester I'm going to change. I usually get some sense at the beginning of what went on and how people are feeling, but I learned, I was in a faculty development course this summer, that maybe a couple weeks out from the beginning, ask people how it feels like it's going. And then mid-semester, and I kind of have informally, but I'm going to like make it more clear and distinct that I'm looking for that from students. And if we need to make adjustments in terms of the class and how it's going. So that there's a lot of interaction input. It'll be nice to be in person again because I like my students and I like to see them. And, you know, even though I feel like I've had some relationships with them in the last year and a half or so, being in person, nothing replaces being in person, as you well know.
Yeah. I mean, my brother just started college last semester and he has done the entire semester online from his bedroom.
Yeah.
And I just keep telling him, like, that's not how you're supposed to do college. He's on campus next semester, but like, it was just kind of a weird, off-putting beginning to college when you do it all online in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and teaching, you know, we were in the middle of a semester and we had to switch over to online. And I felt like that semester felt a little better because I at least had met everybody and had interactions and knew them somewhat. But the way I teach online, I have done it throughout the pandemic completely synchronously. And I start off a class and I say hi to every single person in the class. And if somebody comes in late, I might mention hi to them, you know, very nonchalant, so it's not, you know, making them self-conscious. And tried to really get to know people a little better because I'm available not just during class, but also by Zoom. I'm really stay in touch. I'm pretty good at getting emails back to them within 12 to 24 hours. You know, the things that I think what happened in the pandemic is for those of us that were really good communicators, we continued to be good communicators. And for those of us who didn't do that and did way too much asynchronous, there wasn't a connection with students. and I think there's a balance. I mean, this semester I may, because I have one class online and one in person, is what I may do is some more asynchronous than I did last semester. And particularly I'm going to Nepal sometime in November, because I told you we have did I tell you we have an orphanage my husband and I support?
No.
Yeah, in Nepal.
That's
And
amazing.
I go, well, I've gone every year except last year. So I'll be doing that sometime in the fall, and that's when they'll have some asynchronous classes.
Is there a way that anyone listening to this podcast could donate to that orphanage?
Well, we have a we have a Facebook page called Freedom Children's Welfare Center, and you have to make sure it's the one run by Joan and John. And you can see I'm blonde. I'm also pretty tall for an old person. I'm 5'7". And in Nepal, you're a giant if you're 5'7". And so we have gone every year and brought clothes and school supplies and toys and that kind of stuff. And then we bring a bunch of money to pay for education. Although in the past year, it hasn't gone as much to education as to survival, I think.
Right. I mean, how did you get started with that?
Well, this is the funny part, is my husband and I had been looking for something to do, right? And I decided, I've had a number of injuries myself, and I decided back in 2011, no, we went to Nepal in 2011, did a trek, and the owner of the trekking company mentioned he had this orphanage that he supported. He was the president of the board of directors. And so the next year I thought, I'd really like to find a multi-day ultra. And so we thought of him, my husband and I, and we contacted him about the orphanage. And we did the 3-day race and raised money via doing the 3-day race. And also, we made it a point to really spend time at the orphanage. I watched kids develop and grow up from like age 5 to 17, 18. And we even brought, one year, we even brought a bunch of people from the race where they said they had this charity, but I'm not too sure about the charity they had. And they all contributed and played with the kids, and we had a fun day. So it was our way of doing something small for a nonprofit that we, because a little bit of money goes a long way in Nepal. So when you're sending them thousands of dollars, they're like, it's pretty remarkable. And so they, so we have gone every year. We've stayed friends with one young woman in particular who's now in her village and not happy. We'd really like to bring her here, but it's a whole tricky thing to bring people here and get visas, and particularly now since Nepal is currently locked down. But these kids, they play and they have a great time, and they're getting educated, and Nepal has no public education. So all the education if kids get education at all in Nepal, people have to pay for it. So that really can make a big difference. So our money has gone to education, and this year it went to that and other things too. Although they're very self-sufficient. They have a big garden that they've acquired, so that they're in terms of vegetables and that sort of thing, are completely self-sufficient. And in Nepal, it's beef and chicken are a premium. And so they do lentils and veggies, big staple. So they've got through the pandemic by, being self-sufficient with that stuff. But, it's like anything, you need to buy other supplies.
Right. So let's just talk about how you foresee your third book, because we're very excited about that. Can you give us kind of like, I know we talked about it being advocacy based for women in sports, but can you give us kind of like a rundown of what you expect from that book and how it differs from the two that you've written prior?
Well, one of the things that I really want to do is highlight different programs that are around the country for all cultures. Like there is a Black Women's Sports Foundation that I introduced in this last book that people don't really know about, and they don't know in detail what they do, and they don't understand that the people running it were pretty much pioneers. And so my goal is to find really first of all, discuss what advocacy is, and particularly what advocacy for girls is, and different ways we can give it for girls in sports, and find really effective programs, I think, to highlight, and also the steps other people can take. How can you help to advocate for girls in sports? Can you go volunteer as a coach? Can you go like here in Marin, I live in Marin, north of the Golden Gate County, and we have a new program that a guy from Marin City, which is heavily African American, started. And the whole point of his program, Play Marin, is to get kids of all cultural backgrounds playing together at young ages, so that when they're older, nobody's going, well, I can't be friends with you because you're this, or I can't be, that they're just all kind of on an equal playing field. And so his program is very valuable. And I think the more good examples we have of advocacy for BIPOC people and for white people, the better off will be. And I don't think there's enough advocacy going on for the BIPOC population, particularly in areas like the South. The South is particularly bad. But they're trying to change the voting law so African Americans can't even vote. So it will be an introduction to advocacy to girls and women, and we'll talk about programs. And this is sketchy because I haven't really completely structured it. It will be talking to people like Nancy Hogshead Maker. Do you know who she is?
That name does not sound familiar to me.
Okay. Well, she is a former double gold and silver medalist in the Olympics in swimming in 1984.
Wow.
The same year, Benoit Samuelson won the marathon for the United States. And she was the first American to win the marathon. I think it was the first year of the marathon at all, actually. Anyhow, Nancy Hogshead Maker has been an advocate for female athletes for years, but particularly with elite and pro and Olympic athletes. And she set up a program back in 2012 to support girls who had been sexually assaulted, who had been sexually abused, and to have a place. Now, she's an attorney by training, but it was to have a place for people to go and try to get help that other people might not otherwise help them with. And she's become, her program, Champion Women, is a really great program and has a project going on right now in terms of advocacy and outreach. And she put together this group of athletes and sports professionals. I was on a group called Team Integrity to try to get more regulation going on over the USO PC, US, what is it now?
USOPC,
Yes,
Olympic and
USO
Paralympic Committee.
thank
Yeah.
you. And for safety, for this whole sexual abuse stuff and maltreatment of any kind of abuse. And she did that and drew attention to Congress. And now Congress has put together a commission, which she's been chosen to be on, to oversee the USOPC to make sure they're actually doing enough, because they started a safe sport program in 2017, but this program is overwhelmed. So they need more dollars and more attention paid to taking care of athletes. And it's great. There's going to be this commission overseeing the USOPC because they need it.
So how have you seen, in the age of Title IX, how have you seen the conversation surrounding women's sports change from when it was first passed to now?
Well, I think the biggest impact Title IX has had is there were 300 girls playing sport back then, and now there's 3 million. 300,000 playing back then, now there's 3 million. I think actually Title IX has really helped and encouraged girls' athletic participation significantly, and particularly in high school and college, but it's not enforced. So what happens is you still have a tremendous amount of inequality. Now, pre-pandemic, boys were getting 65,000 more sports scholarships than girls. So there's no equity there, right? And I think in the unfortunate part of the pandemic is it's really, what's one of the first things to go? Art and sports. So it's really, they've been trying to eliminate women's sports, but then they're in worse violation than they were before. So they get called out and they can't do that. We had a situation here in Oakland, California, school district that's always been kind of, I hate to say it, kind of a mess. I worked on there with that district in the 80s, and they were problematic back then. But they had a big shortfall of money for sports. So what do you think they did? They cut more women's sports than men. And they were so out of compliance. It was so lopsided, and so many people, particularly in the Oakland area, there's so many people who are at poverty levels or really low income levels, that the counting on the sports scholarships for college was critical. And so they got called on the carpet about reinstating these programs. So these poor girls that were planning to go to college and all of a sudden their sports gone were actually back in action. And the Raiders, when they were still here before they moved to Vegas, donated a whole bunch of money to make sure the school district kept sports going. And so it's still a problem. There's a lot of and I'll tell you where it's even worse is in the coaches area. Back when there was Title IX and there was girls sports, 93% of girls sports were coached by women. Now it's 41% of girls sports are coached by women, because what's happened is the salaries have now become significant. So then the men kind of apply, and the white men, white men still have the upper hand when it comes to sports. I mean, 89% of sports editors in this country are white men. You know, so that tells you a lot right there. So when we see these little wins, they're significant, but it's frustrating. I think that Muffet McGraw, who was the coach, the basketball coach for Notre Dame, who recently retired, said she's tired of this. Well, there's a woman in this for the first time, or there's a woman in this for the first time. She says, I'm looking to the day when it's not such an anomaly, and that we're embedded enough in leadership positions, particularly in sports. Sports is way worse in terms of leadership for women than actually the workplace. That that women like her are in leadership positions and are being hired. And that even men who coach girls teams really aren't necessarily particularly aware of how bad it is for girls in sports. I mean, Gino Ariyama, who's a coach of UConn, when he was asked why there aren't more women coaching, his response was, because they don't want to. His daughter is a professor at UConn and said immediately on text, walk it back, Dad. And he got all kinds of trouble for that. But that's how ignorant, white men, it's not that women don't want to coach. They're not given the opportunity to coach. And it's even worse for African-American women and women in general in coaching. I mean, if a woman loses a coaching job, even if it's trumped up charges and it's not really true, it's hard for them to become a coach again at the same level. With a white guy, he just goes to a different school or team, no big deal. And there was a case in Iowa with a field hockey team with a coach who had gone to college there, had coached the field hockey team for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years. And an informal complaint was made about her coaching. And it ended up, the whole thing spiraled out of control. And it ended up her being fired for no good reason. And part of the problem was the AD was didn't really support women in coaching roles. And then his associate AD, who was a woman and happened to be this woman's partner, said, why are we getting rid of one of our best coaches? And because she complained, and they think possibly maybe because they were partnership, even though they were really low key about it, it wasn't, a lot of people didn't know. What happened is, what eventually happened was then she got put on administrative leave. But before she did that, he hired another associate to work with the girls' field hockey team. And turns out the white guy he hired was being paid $70,000 more a year. And so she eventually got fired. So both these women sued the coach and the former AD, who said now her career is completely ruined. She was an associate AD. She was hoping to move into an AD role. So they sued and won. They didn't win enough, in my opinion, but they did win. And girls from the team, because it was a winning field hockey team, left the school. And also some of them sued.
Wow.
So this kind of stuff, a colleague of mine whose sister was a PE teacher down in LA, you think LA is more liberal, right? Well, she was getting close to retirement herself and went in to talk to the AD at this high school and said, you really need to hire some more women. And he said, I'm not going to do that. They can just sue me. Yes. And this is the part when I talk about this, a lot of young girls who are very involved with sports, or even with when I've been at conferences with some of the young sports psychologists, they look at me like, what are you talking about? And it's like, well, this is the kind of stuff going on. So keep your eyes open. Yeah, there's a lot more jobs. But the question will be how many women will be filling them?
Wow. Yeah.
So So it's,
It was interesting because like I wanted to ask you about just generally the landscape of women's sports. I mean, I know in our pre-interview we had talked about the sexual assault with USA Gymnastics and the viral nature of the NCAA women's basketball final. And those were just a couple of examples that had come off the top of my head as we were talking. And I mean, it's really insane the way that we're still talking about this kind of stuff.
yep. And we need to keep talking. I mean, the person I really respect and I think has really pushed and struggled since she was on the 1999 World Cup team that when the United States won it for the first time, soccer team, is Julie Foudy. I mean, she hangs in
Yeah, I
there,
love her.
hangs in there, and hangs in there. And that's what you got to do. I don't think by the time I'm gone, things will be equal. And that's why the title of this current book, Stand Up and Shout Out, is because we need to stand up and shout out when there's obviously horrible inequities, like what happened with the Final Four situation. And that prior to the year before the last Winter Olympics, women's ice hockey was getting paid nothing. And then they said they were going to boycott the Worlds. And then they tried to find replacement players. Well, they couldn't find them. They looked at them in high school and college, and women just didn't bite. And then they still didn't change it. And then teams started, I mean, professional men's teams started stepping up. You know, the NHL, the NFL, I can't remember. I'm trying to remember who else, but those are two good examples stood up. And they still weren't going to do anything. Finally, they got a letter from, kind of trying to remember, 15 or 20 senators saying, you need to do something. And they finally did something. But look at soccer. I mean, could Megan Rapinoe do more than she's doing? I mean, we need more Megan Rapinoes around because it needs to keep being called out because, you know, last year when the head of USA Soccer got fired, he got fired because he implied that the women weren't intellectually or physically capable of playing at high levels.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that coming out, and the word capable was just so insulting.
Oh my God. You know, I like watching soccer, but I'd much rather watch women's soccer than men's.
I would as well. I mean, I almost exclusively watch women's soccer.
Yeah, me too.
And it's not to say that like I don't appreciate men's soccer as well, but I honestly think that women's soccer is more entertaining to watch.
I do too.
And like the fact that they're still struggling even after all the World Cups that they've won is insane. It is insulting.
It is, Julia. It
I
doesn't
mean,
make
like,
sense.
and
It
the
doesn't
fact
make sense.
that Megan Rapinoe is still having these conversations and they're still, after decades
Yep.
of inequality, they're still struggling.
Yeah.
I mean, how much more can they do?
Well, they have to keep doing it. You know, we need to have a Megan Rapinoe in every sport. Now, the WNBA as a league is doing incredible things to support women in sport, and we need that in every sport. We need women that are going to be activists. There's an organization.
Oh, no, you said there's an
organization called International Working Group in Women in Sport, and it was started in 1994 with the Brighton Declaration to improve women's sports, and they have this conference every 4 years. And I went to the last one and presented. It was in Botswana. And talk about energy for women and positive things, and leaders from around the world. I was lucky because I got to interview a number of them from different countries. We need that kind of thing, not only happening globally, but happening here more. And I think it's starting to go. We've got at San Jose State has an Institute for Sport, Society, and Social Change. It's brand new. It's really been, they're going on their second year, but it's more like a first year because of the COVID situation. And I'm excited because they're co-conveners to the social change aspect of the next conference, which is next May in New Zealand. And I'm happy to say I've joined the team for the planning for that. So, and it was really interesting because I was in a meeting with them the other day, and there was a woman I interviewed for my book from Barbados that was at the meeting. And then I started looking at the list of some of the international folk, and they're people I met at the last conference. So it was pretty exciting to see that kind of connection going on, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that women in sport they're such a small, tight-knit community because they all feel collectively like they're fighting against the patriarchy.
Well, they are.
And they are. I mean, what do you think it's going to take for us to stop making headlines?
Oh, I think we're going to have to make headlines for a long time. I really do. And we're going to have to really fight to make inroads, like in coaching. We have to fight more. People have to step up for leadership roles. And we need to highlight the people that are doing things. That's why I want to write a book on advocacy, because it's like, this is happening all over. Why don't some of these programs you could model after in some other part of the country, as long as you give them credit for modeling after them. But there's a lot being done, but it's not being actively talked about near as much as it needs to be. And there needs to be, like I said, 10 more Megan Rapinos or more, of course. And I think it's just going to be, like, for somebody like me, a lifelong fight. But I think that we have to have more people kind of jump aboard to help.
And so as we're talking about women making history, what did it mean for you to become an AASP Fellow? Because that's an amazing accomplishment.
Well, I have to tell you, I didn't really expect it to happen. I think I told you that. I applied, and I've been doing innovative stuff since the 80s. And one of the questions they ask on the app is, what have you done that's unique? Well, I had maybe 10, 12 significant things that were done before anybody was doing them. And I have worked within AASP, not always as an academic, but much more as a private provider. And there's been tremendous opposition to recognizing the value of some of these clinics and programs and people. But that's really changing. And our current president is a private practitioner, sports psychologist too. And so one of the things that was in the AASP application is you have to list all your writing that you've contributed. And in the past, the primary focus has been on academic or for the AASP newsletter or something like, related to those things. And so I've done tons of articles and writing over the years, but they've been really, since I turned to being involved in writing, heck, it's been what, 22 years now? I mean, not 22, 12 or 13 years. So I have a lot of writing, but it's not academically based. And even the former president who wrote me a letter of endorsement said, Joan, don't be disappointed. And don't be surprised if accept you. And so my whole contention had been, I'm probably not going to get it. I mean, my expectation was. And so when I did get it, I was shocked, quite frankly, and surprised. And it made me feel like, okay, all this work I've done, much of it, certain amount of it pro bono, is paid off. And I think that I do have expertise, particularly around female athletes, but I have also expertise around other areas of sports psychology. And so to become an AASP Fellow just means that people have recognized that. And that really is exciting.
So let's wind down this interview by talking about how to stay on top of everything that's happening in the world of sports psychology. All of the professional athletes who are publicly making it known that they're struggling with something. Because I guess next week's episode of this podcast coming out, I'm talking to the man who works for the Toronto Raptors, and he is just in charge of their sports psychology and their player wellness. And we had a huge conversation about just how do we continue with the momentum that these professional athletes have already started. I mean, the NBA has done a great job in terms of players speaking out about sports psychology issues. So
Mhm.
how can we continue to keep the ball rolling on talking very publicly about those issues?
Well, one of the things we need to do publicly is really define what a sports psychologist is. Because in the state of California, you cannot call yourself a psychologist at all unless you have not only a PhD, but you have a psychologist license. So anybody who doesn't have that in the state of California is not a psychologist. So we have to differentiate between that, because there's a lot of people running around calling themselves sports psychologists that aren't. And the one thing I have to say about that AASP has done a really good job of, even though I'm facing taking an exam soon, is in their certified mental performance consultants of all these requirements that you have to have in terms of learning and teaching and experience, that really provides a level of foundation. And I'm sure, is this Angus you're talking to?
No, his name is Dr. Alex Arbach.
Okay, I don't know him, um, but anyhow, we have to define what it is. And it's just like all mental health, really, in a lot of ways. Sports psychology is kind of like grouped into that. We need to make it like normal, like people do it all the time. Like, oh my, that beach volleyball, Carrie, what's her name? Was in her fourth Olympics. Walsh.
Yeah, Carrie Walsh.
Yes. She has seen a sports psychologist for a long time. She and her old partner, Misty May, went there for couples counseling. I thought that was great. They came out about that. And she makes it very normal. So I think more people need to speak up about the importance of sports psychology and what it can really contribute. And one of the things that I see now, granted, there's a guy on this listserv I'm on that posts a lot of jobs. But what I'm observing and hearing is there's a lot more opportunities for sports psychologists. My concern is that they don't always go to men, these jobs, that they go to women and men. So I think there's a lot more opportunities for somebody to really thrive in the sports psychology world if they're willing to do a niche that may not have been their first choice, but at least gets them started. And I think that's true for all private businesses. You have to find a niche, what's your specialty, and really define it and do it. And then, you know, you build up more knowledge and credibility and experience, and then people respect you. And I think that's been a critical aspect of what needs to happen in the future. And I think more people should be joining AASP if you really want to learn about sports psychology. The Association of Applied Sports Psychology is a great place to go to and start, even if you just go to one conference. So you get kind of some sense of what's going on in the field and the research on the field. Lots of students go to their conferences. I still go. I present.
Will you be in Vegas this year?
Yeah.
I'm trying to go.
Oh, good. I
Yeah.
hope you can. I'd love to meet you in person.
Yeah, for sure.
But I try to stay active in the organization in the sense that I'm in the women's SIG. I've been very involved in the media SIG.
Yeah, I'm in there as well.
Oh, you are? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, Michelle, who is the head of it, and I are really good colleagues and have been. In fact, we're doing a presentation this year.
That's great.
On media and sports psychology.
Yeah, I was
We've
in
done
Zoom,
a number
like,
of them.
a couple months ago. She held a Zoom, just like an update Zoom, and I was in there, and they were talking about how to get your private practices more social media friendly. So how do you market your private practice on social media? And I actually kind of helped like impromptu like social media training on that Zoom, just like I'm here and I can help. And so I just kind of like low key walked them through how to like set up business on Facebook and like how to run ads. I mean, those are the kind of things that when you're running a private practice, no one really teaches you.
Well, you know, it's interesting though, because traditionally, in at least in the therapist world, you weren't supposed to advertise. In fact, we were forbidden from advertising as a psychologist.
Why? Why was that?
Because there were somehow it just had to happen by osmosis. You just had to be so good, and how do you get good if people don't know about you, you know, and you don't get a chance to work with them? And they finally lifted that now, so you can advertise, but you would lose your license. Back in 1991, when I got my psychologist license, I couldn't advertise. I mean, I did it by doing groups, you know, flyers and reaching out and talking to lots of groups. That's one of the things that made it so comfortable for me in terms of talking to anyone.
So like, was your entire business model just referrals?
Well, no, it was not just referral. It was also specific people who were referring to me that had access to people that worked with people who needed to be referred. And so I built relationships over the years. The interesting thing is, though, because I've outlived them, I mean, in terms of staying in this field, is a bunch of my go-to referral people have all retired. So it's like a constant having to rebuild. And I think I'll never forget years ago when my practice was at the top, I was seeing 30 to 35 people a week. And I was in a workshop about marketing. And I really believe you have to spend your life being open to new ideas and new concepts, and that things can change and improve. And what happened is I'm in this, and it was in-person workshop. And so I'm with people, we're talking about it. And I'm like, well, my practice is good. And well, then what are you doing here? I was like, learning new things, because you can always learn new things, which was really funny, that they didn't get that part of things. So, you know.
I mean, in the same way that you're a lifelong athlete, you're also a lifelong learner.
Mm-hmm. And I think,
although you practice differently than you did when you were 18, you also learn differently and apply it differently than when you were 18.
Yeah, exactly. Even differently than when I was 30 or 35. You know, and there's so much happening in sports psychology. It's really helpful. You know, the thing about the conference to me, since I'm still really actively engaged in sports psychology, is that there's new stuff. It's harder, to be honest with you, to find new stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that's doesn't, it's stuff I could be teaching, so I don't go to those things. But the trick is to always search out new methods and ways and techniques to understand them. It's like EMDR, which to me is a technique. Some people have used it as their whole way of doing therapy, and to me, it's a technique. Was revolutionary in its day, and now there's been many other things that have followed up from that. You know, there's a lot more with neurofeedback and that sort of thing. And I can't use a heart rate monitor anymore because it goes too high. It's like, and I'm feeling fine, but it goes too high sometimes. So I just do the best I can, like anybody can, you know, and I think as athletes get older, like my husband was in high school, he was football, lacrosse, and ice hockey. And then he went on to college to play ice hockey. And he was also on the US sailing team in a 2-man boat called the 470. And this guy, my husband's such a tough guy. He had scoliosis when he was a kid, and he played all those sports and rode double centuries and was in the US Olympic trials in 1980. And his boat came in third, and they took the top 2. And then nobody went that year. But he hasn't let that stuff be a problem for him. You know, he's swimming now. He's swimming, getting a big chest. You know, he looks great. He's also younger than me. So, but he stuck with it, you know, and I think the mentality of an athlete or even an exerciser is way different than people who don't. And so I think there's a whole mental attitude, and you have to remain open to hearing new feedback about yourself, to if you make mistakes, admit to them, you know, be willing to apologize. A lot of stuff people aren't willing to do. You know, I'm an expert about stuff, but I can still make mistakes. And I think we just have to pay attention to that more, because making a mistake is not something to be ashamed of or hide at all. I think, you know, there's no such thing really as perfection.
I think that's another thing that athletes do really well. They fail really well.
Yes. Well, Carly Lloyd, you know about her, right? How she got herself kicked off the national team and had to readjust her whole attitude. And as you know, now playing in her 4th Olympics or something.
I think it's 4, yeah.
Yeah. And you know, she's a great example. I tell people that and they go, she got kicked off the national team? It's like, yeah. But she came back. And that's the thing, you know, just because things happen doesn't mean you can't come back. And you have to realize, of course, you may have to come back with some little different boundaries around yourself, but coming back is everything.
Yeah.
So.
And then the last question, what are some books that you have really enjoyed reading? And they don't have to be specifically sports psych or pertaining to the industry at all.
Oh my God. Books off the top of my head? That's a really hard one.
I like asking.
Actually,
I have my bookshelf behind me right here, and I just love asking my interviewees, what have
I
you
wish
been
you'd
reading?
have told me ahead of time, because I'm not good at pulling that off the top of my head.
I mean, they can be
Probably,
fiction or nonfiction or sports psych books.
One of the books that I've read in the last year that I loved was Anti-Racism by Ibrahim, I can't think of his last name, Kendi. And there's another book, I've been doing a lot of reading in terms of African Americans in particular. There's another book, No Mercy by Brian Stevenson.
A bunch of my friends have been loving that one.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Have you read White Fragility?
I read some of it. I wasn't as enthralled by it as some of these other, because I think I think white people need to quit focusing on themselves and just start reading and understanding other cultures. You know, it's like, even though I have had African American clients and colleagues and friends over the years, I think there's so much we don't understand about how poorly African Americans have been treated throughout our culture, and how whites have had so many privileges. And I just think that book really wasn't doing it for me like some of the other ones I've been reading. But I think the two I mentioned to you are the ones that really stuck out.
Yeah.
And we read, my husband and I read a lot of murder mysteries. We love them
I love thrillers.
for fun. We read Carl Hyacin, and he's really, he has a new book out, paperback, that's a spoof of Trump. That's really hilarious. And I highly recommend it. And I can't think of the title off the top of my head. But
It's a quick Google search away. I'll figure it out.
Hyacin. His newest book is a spoof on Trump, and it's like a laugh a minute all the way through it, because it's just so obvious what he's doing, even though, you know, he doesn't say Trump, he does say president. And he calls what did he call? He calls the wife some like weird name too.
I love asking this question at the end of interviews because everyone has such different answers.
Yes.
And some of them are like, okay, I've read this research and this research, or some of them just give me like articles, like sports psych related articles that they've really enjoyed or that have been pertinent to the work that they're doing.
Right.
And some people are like, well, I haven't read any sports psych related books, but here are all of my favorites currently.
Well, you know, I wrote an article. It's not something I read, it's something I wrote on salon.com about Caster Semenya. Do you know who she is?
No.
Oh, you should know about her. She's a South African runner that was born intersex, so that she had genitalia from both, but was raised as a girl. And she came into the running scene in the 2009, something like. Anyhow, she won all kinds of things. She's won a bunch of gold medals, and her testosterone level was high, but not higher than what they originally saw at 10 micromilligrams or something. Anyhow, they changed the level in the running federation, the National Running Federation, whose name is escaping me, so that she couldn't run and compete without taking hormone, you know, estrogen, which made her sick. Now, why would we have, and why are we only doing it to women? You know, and we're only doing it to Black women.
Well, that just
or
happened.
Transgender women.
That actually just happened with the Olympics. There are 2 women that have tested whose testosterone levels are too high.
Well, they need to test the white women too. That's the way I look at it. They don't have any research. Julia, there's no research at all about the validity of testosterone in women making a huge difference. And I propose that they did try to throw together a study that was so flawed and so bad, everybody kind of goes, whatever. It was so clearly a conflict of interest. And a number of scientists have looked at it and said it's like, no, worthless. So I'm waiting for them to do research into testosterone, and I'm waiting for them to look at elite white and African American and Latinx and Asian women to see what their testosterone levels are, because this whole transgender thing is so awful. What's going on? This is one place Nancy Hochschild-Maker and I totally disagree, is I just don't think there's evidence there. I think it's more like the prejudice and the threat people have that somehow these women are, But you don't see the thing that's really crazy, Julia. If it made such a huge difference, right? Why don't we see more women winning gold medals and being, you know, the stars on teams and stuff that are transgender? We just don't see that. So there's no evidence there. So this whole anti-transgender is just more, to me, more anti, not only anti-race, but anti the whole LGBTQ community, which is also a whole nother problem.
Yeah, I mean, so I live in West Virginia, and we are staunchly Republican, minus the area that I live in. We're very liberal.
Sure.
And our legislators just passed a trans athlete ban.
Mm-hmm.
And when they were asked, well, have you seen this in our state? Like, is this a true problem in West Virginia? They couldn't name a single trans athlete. And so then the reporters continued and they were like, well, why do you think this is such a problem if you can't name a single instance of this happening in our state?
I know. It's pretty terrible. Anyhow, I just realized I have a 1:15.
Yeah.
So I better.
I know. We've been talking for so long. I didn't want to stop you, but
well, like, I hope you come to AASP, because we'll have to set up, you know, a cocktail hour or something. Or dinner, you know, it'd be fun.
Yeah, I mean, I have loved talking to you and getting to know you. I mean, I'm done with my questions as of now, and I'm just so happy that you sat down and talked to me.
Oh yeah, no problem. I try to do this with people, and sometimes I get busy and caught up. But the people that are persistent with me are the ones that end up connecting with me. So
yeah, I mean, I saw your name on the Purdue listserv, and because you had just come out with your book and it had just won the bronze medal, and I had seen you kind of contribute to that listserv a couple other times, so I knew your name, and so I just reached out to you kind of as a way to say, okay, tell us about your book, because it's doing really well, and then you have just turned into the most amazing person.
Oh, thanks.
And I'm so glad that like you sat down and talked to me. I've had such a blast.
Pleasure. Yeah, great.
And
well, keep in touch.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
And this episode is coming out in, I think, 2 weeks.
Okay.
So I'll email you once it comes out.
Great. That's great.
And
well, thank you. It was
have
fun.
a great rest of your day, and hopefully I will see you in October.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay.
All right.
Bye. Bye.